Thought the trouble started the exact second I stepped out of my truck and smelled the mountain air of my father's ranch for the first time since we buried him. And honestly, I didn't in Oppos to even have a chance to let the silence sink in before a white SUV came screaming up the gravel road like it was hunting me down. I hadn't in Oppos to even reach the porch of the house where I spent my summers when the door of that Lexus swung open and a woman in a razor-sharp blazer stepped out, clutching a stack of papers like they were a holy crusade, and before I could even say hello, she snapped and quote, "Caleb Thorne, I'm Sandra Vane, president of the High Ridge Estates HOA, and you're already behind on your compliance fines," end quote. I just stood there, the cold wind biting through my denim jacket, looking at this woman who seemed to think she owned the very dirt under my boots, and I remember thinking that this place, my father's ranch, felt like it was holding its breath after a long sleep. I unfolded the notice she shoved into my hand, my confusion turning into a slow, hot burn of anger as I realized she was citing me for, end quote, unauthorized agricultural equipment, end quote, and, end quote, improper perimeter foliage, end quote. So I looked her dead in the eye and told her this property wasn't in Oppos, part of her little suburban playground. She just smiled, and it was the kind of smile you only see from people who have never been told, end quote, no, end quote, in their entire privileged lives, and she told me they claimed, end quote, visual authority, end quote, over the entire horizon line, which apparently included my family's 1,000-acre legacy. I didn't in Oppos know much about HOA law back then, but as her SUV hummed behind her like a predator waiting for a signal, I knew one thing for certain. I hadn't in Oppos just inherited a ranch. I'd inherited a fight that these people were absolutely going to lose. Growing up, I learned the edges of the Thorne Ranch the way other kids learn the cracks in the sidewalk or the timing of the traffic lights, because my father, Silas, walked those fence lines with me every single summer until my legs felt like lead. He'd point at a jagged ridge or a specific bend in the creek where the trout liked to hide, and he'd make me repeat the words his own father had told him, saying, in quote, "Caleb, boundaries matter. Not because they keep the world out, but because they remind you exactly what you're responsible for," end quote. Back then, I was just a kid who wanted to go swimming. I didn't into Oppos understand the weight of responsibility or the way a man carries his land in his marrow. I just liked being beside him, tracing the property like we were explorers in a forgotten corner of Montana. He always had this little leather-bound notebook, worn smooth at the edges and smelling of cedar and old tobacco, filled with sketches of the terrain and notes about fence posts that only he seemed to care about. When I'd ask why he wrote everything down instead of just remembering it, he'd tap his temple and then the book, whispering that memory fades but proof is forever. There was this one afternoon near the western boundary where the hills dip low and the grass grows waist-high, and he knelt beside a weathered post, placing my hand on the splintered wood and telling me this ranch had been fought for, settled, defended, and rebuilt more times than the history books cared to record. He looked at me with those fierce blue eyes and made me promise never to let anyone take what was ours. And at 18, I said the words just to please him, not realizing that life has a way of softening your convictions until they end Oppos, as thin as paper. I left for the city the moment I could, hungry for a life that didn't end Oppos. Tea involved the smell of diesel, wet hay, and 4:30 in the morning, and my father didn't end Oppos. Argue. He just gave me that slow nod that men give when they're proud of you and breaking inside at the same time. I promised I'd visit, and I did, but the visits got shorter and the phone calls got further apart as I got swallowed by corporate deadlines and the neon noise of Seattle. I told myself he was fine, that the land kept him grounded, but what I didn't in Oppos, what I never even bothered to imagine, was that the battles he'd warned me about hadn't in Oppos. Stopped just because the world was getting modern. At the funeral, the neighbors dropped these little hints, these awkward pauses and quiet sighs about how Silas was a, end quote, strong man who stood his ground until he couldn't into Oppos. Anymore, end quote. But I was too buried in grief to ask what they meant. It wasn't in Oppos, until I sat in his dim office, surrounded by the smell of dust and old maps, that I opened that leather notebook and realized my father hadn't into Oppos. He'd been fighting the weather or the passage of time. He'd been fighting a creeping, bureaucratic ivy that was trying to strangle the ranch while I was busy chasing a paycheck. Near the back of the book, there was a note addressed to me in his trembling, late-stage handwriting that said, end quote, Caleb, if you're reading this, the fight has reached your door. I held the line as long as I could, but some wars dawn in Oppos. In with the man who starts them. End quote. The second morning I was there, the harassment went from 0 to 60, and I found 3 new notices taped to my gate with a kind of smug precision that felt like a slap in the face. Citations for, end quote, obsolete machinery, end quote, referring to my father's 1950s tractor, end quote, structural nonconformity, end quote, regarding the barn my grandfather built with his own 2 hands. I didn't in Oppos. Called their office. I just drove straight to the High Ridge Clubhouse, which looked more like a 5-star resort than a neighborhood center, all glass walls and manicured lawns that felt fake compared to the rugged beauty of the ranch. Sandra Vane was there, of course, presiding over a desk like a queen, and when she saw me, her smile didn't end Oppos, to even reach her eyes as she told me there, end quote, community standards, end quote, applied to any property that influenced the, end quote, visual value, end quote, of their development. I told her she had 0 jurisdiction over private ranch land, and she leaned back, looking at me with this chilling pity, and said, end quote, your father understood our authority, Caleb. He may have been stubborn, but he complied where it mattered, end quote. That was a lie. I knew it in my gut, because my father would have sooner burned that barn to the ground than let a woman in a blazer tell him what color to paint it. I saw a map on the wall behind her, a big aerial shot of the development, and something caught my eye, a dotted line that didn't in Oppos. Seemed to align with where the clubhouse actually sat. I didn't in Oppos. Say anything then. I just felt my heart thudding against my ribs as I walked out, realizing that Sandra wasn't in Oppos. Just overstepping. She was terrified of something, and she was using aggression to hide it. A few days later, a county inspector showed up on a, end quote, tip, end quote, about hazardous waste, looking embarrassed as he checked my perfectly clean equipment, and he whispered to me that he'd been out here a dozen times when my father was alive because of, end quote, anonymous complaints, end quote, from the HOA. Then the social media attacks started, with people in the High Ridge Facebook group posting photos of my ranch and calling it a, end quote, dilapidated eyesore, end quote, that was tanking their property values, and I'd walk into the local feed store and feel the weight of their judgment in the silence of the room. It was suffocating, this feeling of being hunted in my own home. So I went back to the maps, back to the dusty boxes in the cellar, and I called up an old family friend named Elias Thorne. No relation, just an old-school surveyor who knew every rock in this county. We spent a day in the mud, tracing the old markers my father had obsessed over, and Elias stopped near the High Ridge swimming pool, spat on the ground, and said, and quote, Caleb, that pool line in Oppos, just close to your line. It's about 15 feet over it. And quote, my blood went cold as he explained that the entire eastern wing of their $1 million clubhouse was sitting on my dirt, and it wasn't in Oppos. A mistake. It was a gamble. I hired a lawyer who specialized in, end quote, land grab, end quote, cases, a sharp woman named Sarah who lived for ruining the days of people like Sandra Vane, and we went to the county records vault, digging through layers of paper until we found it. The, end quote, ghost lease, end quote, back in the late 80s when High Ridge was just a dream in a developer in Oppos. As head, my grandfather had signed a 30-year land use agreement allowing them to build their amenities on a sliver of our ranch to help the local economy, but the lease had expired nearly a decade ago. There was a clause in there, written in plain, undeniable English, that stated if the lease was and Oppos renewed, all structures had to be removed at the HOA's expense within 6 months, and my father had intentionally let it expire because they started treating him like a servant instead of neighbor. He wasn't in Oppos, end quote, complying, end quote. During those last years, he was waiting. He was letting them build their empire on a foundation of sand, knowing that one day the bill would come due. The night of the emergency HOA meeting was probably the most satisfying moment of my entire life, and I walked into that room full of people who had spent weeks calling me a, end quote, trashy rancher, end quote, and I just sat in the back until Sandra started her speech about, end quote, cleansing the perimeter, end quote. I stood up, walked to the front, and laid that expired lease on the table like it was a live grenade. And the silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a hay knife. I watched the blood drain out of Sandra's face as Sarah, my lawyer, explained that they weren't into oppos. T just trespassing. They were technically in quote, illegal occupants in quote, of 12 acres of Thorn Ranch land, including their precious pool and half their clubhouse. The board members started looking at each other like they were on a sinking ship, and one of them, a guy who looked like he was about to have a heart attack, asked Sandra if she knew about this. She tried to lie. She tried to say there was a, in quote, verbal extension, in quote, but I just pulled out my father's notebook and showed them the entry from the day he refused to sign her renewal, where he wrote, in quote, let them build, the higher the tower, the harder it falls, in quote. The judge didn't end oppose. T even hesitated during the hearing a week later. She looked at the evidence of the false county reports, the harassment, and the undeniable land encroachment, and she issued a, in quote, cease and desist, in quote, that effectively padlocked their clubhouse until a, in quote, full restoration of the boundary, in quote, could be completed. I didn't in oppose. T want their money, and I didn't in oppose. T want to see a bunch of families lose their pool, but I wanted them to understand that you don't and oppose. T mess with a man and oppose. S legacy, just because you don't and oppose. T liked the view of his tractor. The HOA board ended up firing Sandra Vane that same night, and word around town is she's being sued by the very residents she tried to lead because their property values actually did tank the moment the clubhouse was declared a legal liability. The new board president came to my porch yesterday, hat in hand, offering a formal apology and a very, very expensive new lease agreement that gives me total veto power over any future, in quote, visual standards, in quote, they might dream up. I'm sitting on that porch now, watching the sun dip behind the ridge, and the ranch finally feels like it's mine, not just something I'm holding for a dead man, but a living, breathing part of who I am. My father was right. Boundaries aren't an oppos. T just about keeping people out. They're about knowing what's worth defending with everything you've got. And I think I finally understand why he never left this place. But here's the thing that's been bothering me, and maybe you can tell me what you think. The new HOA board is offering me enough money and lease fees to retire right now and never work another day in my life. But it means keeping their, in quote, suburban, in quote, influence attached to my land forever. Part of me wants to take the money and fix up every barn on the property, but another part of me wants to tell them to get their clubhouse off my dirt and tear it down just to finish what my father started and return the ridge to the way it looked 100 years ago. Is it better to compromise and live in luxury? Or is the only true victory found in clearing the land completely, even if it leaves you with nothing but the dirt and the silence? Leave a comment and let me know if I should take the deal or bring the bulldozers. Because honestly, I'm still holding my father's notebook, and I can almost hear him whispering that some things aren't in oppos. T for sale at any price.